Professor Chandran Kukathas is a guest of the Istituto Bruno Leoni Mises seminar with a lecture on immigration and freedom. Professor Kukathas, immigration is clearly a concrete aspect and exercise of freedom, but at the same time it can become a challenge for public order and security, which are also relevant values also from a liberal point of view. How can we reconcile these two aspects, security and freedom of movement?
Well, I think there are different aspects to the question of security, and it's important to distinguish them. In one way, immigration control is really not a good way of addressing the security question, particularly if you're thinking about the security issues that arise out of the current state of the world with problems of terrorism, terrorist attacks, and so on. Immigration control is not a good way to deal with that because immigration control has so many aspects to it that not all of them are relevant to the problem of security. With security, what you want to do is you want to make sure that people who are dangerous don't cross the border, or if they do cross the border, that you are able to track and monitor them. But this does not require you to track and monitor everyone who enters the country as a tourist, who comes in as a student, who comes in to take up a job, who comes in to visit elderly parents or in-laws. So I think it's very important that we think about the security question by asking, if there are security concerns, what are the appropriate measures that we should take to address these? And many of these security concerns are best addressed by police action, by some kind of institutions that are aimed at tracking the people who are causing trouble. Now, the other aspect of it may be that there are security concerns that arise as a result of the movement of people generally. If you have people moving into a society, they may not speak the same language, they may not have the same customs, they may not share the same traditions. And of course, I think this is something that political authorities need to be mindful of. They need to think about what are the appropriate public policies that they should have in place, what facilities are there for there to be translations so that people don't fall afoul of the law because they don't know what's going on. All of these things, I think, are important to deal with because the movement of people anywhere may raise these issues. But I would say that once again, it's important not to simply try to address this by immigration control as such. You're not going to solve this problem by making it more complex to come into a society, by making it more difficult for people to come in, by making it more difficult for, let's say, parents to visit their children if they come from particular countries. So I really want to say that security is an important concern, but when security is the concern, we should look to the specific security measures that are important rather than just think controlling immigration is a way of dealing with the security question in itself.
Even with your point of view on security, that is not a very big deal on immigration, or it is a deal manageable with immigration, the presumed, or at least the presumed foremost problem in Europe is by now immigration. Does the classical liberal theory have enough tools to suggest how to manage this apparently unresolvable problem in Europe?
Well, I think the biggest contribution that classical liberalism makes is in its analysis of the state. And really what it says is that there are certain things that the state really cannot control, but also that the state may itself generate certain sorts of problems. Now, in certain ways, the immigration question and the refugee crisis in particular are problems that have been created by the state. They're a product of the state system. If you did not have a system of sovereign states with a very strong emphasis on territorial sovereignty, you would not have either the immigration problem or the refugee problem. In a world in which there was freer movement, many of these problems would simply not exist, just as we don't have a problem of free movement within Europe, and you don't have a problem because of free movement within the continental United States. So the question is, why is there this problem? And the answer is, well, you have this problem because you have state boundaries. And therefore, what you have is a system which is emphasizes the importance of controlling the movement of these people. Now, of course, there are hundreds of thousands and even millions of people who want to come into a particular area within which there is already free movement, if you're thinking about Europe, for example. But Europe has 500 million people. Now, even if you take the case of the refugees, 1 million people, or 2 million, or 3 million people moved in, it's less than the number of people who would just be born into Europe, every 2 or 3 years. So it's a tiny percentage of the movement that we've got, and the emergence of new citizens and residents that we've got without a single person coming in as a refugee. I think what classical liberalism says is we need to look more closely at the operation of the state to see how it's actually generating a problem that it then cannot solve with the tools and institutions that it has by its nature. So what I think classical liberals would say to others is, if you're concerned about immigration and you want to ask the question, how does the state solve it? The answer is we need to reform the state.
In a more liberal sense.
In a more liberal direction.
In a more open direction.
Indeed.
In matter of multiculturalism, your opinion expressed in the liberal archipelago is more extreme than in the classical liberal theory. And given the raising of terrorism into our society, are you still persuaded that an open and free society must accept even illiberal communities?
I think I feel that even more strongly in a sense, because this is really what is central to liberalism. Liberalism at the political level is a doctrine that says even within a liberal society you should accept, for example, communist parties which might be dedicated to the overthrow of the political system. The liberal attitude is to say, well, if you want to try to persuade your fellow citizens of this, then you should have the freedom to do so. And equally, a vitally important part of any liberal outlook is the attitude that people should be free to choose their own way of life and with whom they want to associate and what kind of community they should build. Now, liberals are also very keen to say that you should not be able to force others to live in the way that you would prefer. So there are therefore natural limits to the extent that a liberal society and liberal laws would not enforce someone's attempt to force somebody else to live in the way that they want. And I think that actually provides a very, very important and powerful check against any kind of illiberal society, because it's only going to be sustainable in the long run if the people who are members of that illiberal society actually want to sustain it. Now, I concede that in the short term, of course, there may be, as a result of this, injustices that people suffer, coercion that suffered by people as a result of the exercise of power within their liberal communities. That, I think, is partly simply a problem that is endemic to the human condition. What I worry about is those who say, because these problems are there, we need to try to develop institutions, in particular liberal institutions, that will eliminate this. Now, the reality is that you can't. All you can do is you can check it to some degree. And I think we should not go further than to try to check it by simply the normal protection of individual rights, accepting that they may be, from time to time, people who will nonetheless not have all their rights respected. But it's better to do that than to go further in a direction of a general illiberalism in an attempt to prevent local illiberalism.
So, if I understood, the point of no return in tolerating liberal communities is the balance between individual liberties and communitarian lifestyle. I think, for example, about the burqa case. Is this the point? In the case of contrast between an individual freedom and the communitarian freedom, must prevail the individual one?
I think that's one way of putting it, and I think that's an important point, that the individual should be left free to make her own choices in these matters. Now, the argument put by those who, for example, want to ban the burqa would put is that it's only by banning the burqa that we can protect the freedoms of these individuals on the assumption that they have been coerced into doing this. Now, I think that argument is problematic for a couple of reasons. One is that it assumes that all people who make this choice are coerced, and that is not the case. There are many people who make these choices of their own free will when with full understanding. Now, of course, it's perfectly possible that some people do it because of the result of social pressure, of informal norms that, incline them to do things that they might not otherwise want. And I think this is important, but equally I think it's important for liberals to recognize that the way to address these problems is not through coercion, not through the enforcement of laws, because for one thing, in principle, this goes against the liberal idea of leaving people to make their own decisions. But for another thing, as a matter of social policy, it can also have other, perhaps unintended, but deleterious effects. For example, once you do this in an attempt to control other communities, it also makes other communities close ranks and strengthen their own internal norms. They might become less likely to liberalize or less likely to engage with the outside world because now they're people who regard themselves as under threat. So I think liberals have to be very, very cautious about trying to force liberalism upon people, whether it's individually or in communities. I think it's illiberal in itself, but it's not guaranteed to produce a more liberal society.
At the end, an open and free society is more dangerous and more open than a society closed in its border, or even is less dangerous and more free.
So I think in general, closed societies, and this is a matter of degree, it's not that societies are either open or closed, there are degrees of openness. The more closed the society, the not only the more unfree it is in many respects, but I think also the more dangerous it is. Because a closed society is necessarily going to be one which is much more politically monitored, much more politically repressive, much more inclined to regulate and monitor and survey its citizens, simply because that is what needs to be done in order to close the society. Closing a society doesn't mean just closing the borders. Closing the society means restricting what people can do so that you preserve a particular character of the society. Well, you can't do that without exercising a great deal of control, which means more monitoring, more police, and more punishment. And this means that increasingly people will be inclined to rebel and then be caught and then be punished. I think you'll get a much more troubled society the more closed it is.
Thank you, Professor Kukathas, for this optimistic view of our contemporary and pluralistic society. Thank you.
Thank you very much.